Good evening, everyone. These chairs, it's quite hard not to look kind of too relaxed in these chairs, so I'll try and lean forward so I don't seem inappropriately loose. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation and a proud York resident. The NHS Confed is the membership organisation for leaders across the NHS in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but that's not what you're here to talk about. It's my great pleasure to welcome you onto campus this evening for an event which will explore and debate the first 100 days of Labour. I think that's tomorrow, the 100th day. I'm on the Today programme talking about 100 days of health policy. They'll probably drop me for someone more interesting, but that's the plan at the moment. So 100 days of Labour. What have we learnt so far about the likelihood of Labour having an impact on the very high levels of inequality that we have in the UK? That's what we're here to discuss. Now, this is part of the University of York's Open Lecture series. This is in partnership with the York Policy Engine, or TYPE. Do you see what they did there? It's quite right, the York TYPE. It's a cross-faculty initiative supporting all academic disciplines at the university. Across this session, I'm going to be interviewing our expert panel. We really couldn't have three greater experts on the issues of inequality, social justice than we have tonight. Let me introduce this esteemed panel. I used to run an organisation called the RSA, and I did lots and lots of events, and all these folk I've interviewed before, and they're absolutely brilliant. So you're in for an exciting hour or so. So first of all, Kate Pickett. Professor Kate Pickett is Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Health Sciences and academic co-director of Health Equity North. Her research interests are in the social determinants of health and health inequalities. She's joined by co-author for many of her publications, particularly the famous book, The Spirit Level, Professor Richard Wilkinson. He's a researcher in social inequalities in health. He's Emeritus Professor of Public Health at the University of Nottingham, honorary visiting professor here at York, and very few people have a more distinguished record in talking about inequality in this country than Richard. And then we're also joined by Danny Dorling. Professor Danny Dorling is a social scientist whose books include Inequality and the 1% and All That Is Solid. He's the Holford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford and a patron of Road Peace, Comprehensive Future, and Healy City Farm. His most recent books are Seven Children and Peak Injustice, Solving Britain's Inequality Crisis. There'll be more about their books later because they're outside, but critical things for you to know. The Spirit Level, incredibly influential book about inequality. It's now 15 years old, and this is the 15-year kind of update. Excellent. Act Now is a book that Kate and Richard and Danny all contributed to. It's a kind of comprehensive guide to how we can make Britain better. I'm a Blairite, so I would describe this as a kind of reheated Corbyn manifesto, but it's still good, don't get me wrong, just getting a bit of kind of, you know, a bit of friction going there. And then we've got Danny's book, Seven Children, Inequality in Britain. So they've written lots of books. They're fantastic people. So we're going to have a conversation for about half an hour or so, and then we're going to open up to you. So as you listen, do think about the questions that you want to ask, the points that you want to make when we open it up. Oh, there's my phone. How embarrassing. Let me just turn it off. It'll be the Today programme cancelling me, almost certainly. Oh, no, it's not. It's someone from NHS England telling me what to say on the Today programme. Right, OK. So the first question, what do you make of it so far? In terms of this first 100 days, in terms of what was in Labour's manifesto, what we think Rachel Reeves is going to say in her budget, do you have much hope that this is a government that is going to tackle inequality? And Dan, I'll put you in the middle. I'll start with Kate.
Well, I went to Labour Party conference the other day, and I found the mood quite surprising. I thought that post-election they'd be quite buoyant, but actually I felt a lot of tension there and a surprising amount of defensiveness so early in. And I think that was because they've made some silly mistakes in this first 100 days, most noticeably accepting donations and gifts. And so I think they were sort of reeling from that.
Can I just say that when we were in government in 97, we took £1 million from Bernie Ecclestone and let him put fag adverts on the side of fallen wall. I mean, we did it properly when it came to...
Times have changed.
But, you know, so...
Times have changed.
Okay.
These days, you really should pay for your own clothes.
Right.
They were also surprisingly already a bit defensive about policy. And I think that was probably because an awful lot of people are already disappointed that they aren't tackling particular things, like the 2-child limit, like more substantial promises around taxing wealth. So I think...
explain, most people will know, but just explain what the 2-child limit is in case there are people who don't.
The 2-child limit limits benefits for families who've got more than 2 children. So it's a penalty on larger families. And most academics and people working in children's charities and people concerned with child poverty think that it's an obvious first thing to do if you're serious about tackling child poverty. And instead, what Labour have come in and done is set up a child poverty task force, which they say will report in the spring, and is clearly a ruse so that they can then say, experts have told us we need to do that, get rid of the 2-child limit, and then they probably will, I think. But that period of time during which they're not acting on child poverty in the way that lots of people want them to means that I think we'll see at least 200,000 more families become poor, and we will not have families lifted out of it. So I felt like there was a lot of frustration from people who think that they should have come in and hit the ground running and done some things really quickly in that buoyant moment of having a landslide. So at the moment, I feel it's a bit mixed, but there are positive signals on lots of policy fronts, so I'm feeling it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Great. Danny?
I'm oddly slightly more positive about what's happened in the first 100 days, which may seem strange if you know where I stand. A week before the 2017 general election, I was one of the 42nd people who appeared in the general election broadcast with John McDonnell, filmed by Ken Loach. So we are, I'm not sure if we're sitting the right way around, we might be from your point of view. Why am I positive? Well, one comparison you can make is with 1997. That's the last time Labour came in a similar situation. And in 1997, for 2 years, they stuck to Conservative spending plans. Now already that is wobbling. Rachel Reeves is talking about changing the rules that Gordon Brown made up. I mean, there's nothing, these rules are made up rules, but she is actually talking about changing them, which would allow her to do something different to what she had done. It's very different from 1997, in that 1997 was a proper landslide. You know, a huge landslide. Lots of votes, lots of seats landslide. This election shocked them because fewer people voted Labour than had in 2019. And the left, my set of people, we've been as good as gold. We kept our mouths shut. We were proper comrades. We said nothing that publicly about lying, partly because I want to stay in the Labour Party, but also it's childish to attack people within a party. And we hadn't done that. Starmer and Reeves had a free rein to get as many votes as they could and got less than Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. And they really didn't expect to get that. Lovely Ed Davey, you know, who we learnt much more about in his life. Turns out he's a really nice person and he can go and well as... Him and the Liberals got fewer votes, right? So they're in charge in a country absolutely full of despair and apathy. They're shocked by reform. Sunak probably called the election early because they could see where reform were going and how much stronger that they were getting. Two-child limit. The person whose organisation produced the most devastating statistic is a man called Torsten Bell. 56% of children in this country who have a brother and a sister are going seriously hungry 2, 3 or 4 times a month. And why are they going? A majority of children with a brother and sister are going hungry because the difference that child benefit would make. So you do a review and you are condemning most children with a brother and sister to hunger next month, the month after, and so on. Torsten's now an MP. Right? One of the most serious of these, Swansea, has just been put into that. Labour have suddenly got this enormous number of MPs. Most of them can never be junior ministers. There aren't enough. You can't create that many junior minister posts. They are representing, without exception, every single one of the poorest constituencies in this country, the majority of which are poorer, if they're in the poorest fifth, than most of the poorest fifth of Eastern Europe. The heights of children are going down in these constituencies. The malnutrition is getting worse. The infant mortality rates are actually rising. If you remember that baby, he starved to death in January at the beginning of this year next to his dad's dead body, which was a scandal until people discovered, oh, it's Skegness, and then it went quiet. The statistics showed that there's another 80 additional of those. Now, those MPs are doing, at least half of them are turning up on Friday. I hope Torsten goes to Swansea every Friday. It's impossible, and you can see it crumbling already. The question about the two-child limit is it going to go in 12 months or in 18? It's just inconceivable it doesn't go. And at the same time, you have in Scotland a Scottish child payment being made to children, which if you've got 3 children and you're in the poorest 2/7, that's £4,000 a year extra. No child in Scotland goes hungry or cold. And the Labour Party in Scotland and the SNP quietly agree with this policy. I'm optimistic of the language beginning to change. They had to cancel their summer holidays because of some of the worst race riots in all of Europe that occurred. And they could have done things that I would have considered far worse. So when you're saying this is awful, this is terrible, it's actually more progressive than 1997 was, and there's a change. The other factor to take in is that, and it's not his fault, Keir had a charisma bypass. Right? He just doesn't, he's not a sellable politician. He went to a posh school where Fat Boy Slim went to, but that's about the only story you can tell about Keir. Right? Whereas, Rishi was dishy and so on. They've all got their phones on. So you get the very bad press. It's an easy target to go for. Rachel Reeves can't do the camera, so they're going to get a lot of this. It's a bit like John Major, that being done for that. But we're going to get bored of that. People are incredibly angry about the situation that we're in. We have another cold winter coming. Prices are 30% higher than they were 2.5 years ago. We're in the longest cost of living crisis since 1798. The prisons are falling down. There's still 200 school roofs that would collapse on children. And last thing I'll say on that, thank God the Tory minister was brave enough at the end of the summer to pull the plug and say those children can't go into those classrooms. Because she had to make a decision, and some of her colleagues wanted those children to go into those classrooms. So it's a dire situation. I am not as upset as some people are about it. They are going to have to tax wealth because it's an emergency. The OBR is telling them that they can't. The dinner table discussions are going on in West London and in Oxford where these things are decided, but those members of Parliament are going on Fridays. And some of them visiting those constituencies for the first time, some of them discovering what regional rail service is like for the first time in their lives. I find it inconceivable that we're not going to get to a situation next year, the year after, where things have been changed, rent regulations have come in, other changes have been made, and we'll be moaning like hell that it's not enough. But if you step back and measure it, I suspect it'll look like progress.
Thank you. Richard, you can remember not just You can remember not just 1997.
Bring back Harold Wilson.
97. You can remember what it felt like in 74 and possibly even as a child what it felt like in
that. 64.
64. So how do these early days of Labour compare?
Well, I thought sometime you were going to ask us about different prime ministers, and it seems to me everyone we have is worse than the last. We'd be happy with any of the earlier ones. But I can agree with most of what Kate and Danny have said. And certainly the new government is better than the last one, but it couldn't fail not to be. But I think most of what's being said is talking about them as if we were in normal times. I don't think we are. I think not only the levels of inequality and the state of the public services and the decline in health, the child poverty and so on that Danny's been mentioning, but above all, climate change, the environmental crisis. And every report that comes out says it's worse than we thought. I was seeing that Jim Keir, chair of the International Panel on Climate Change, was saying that the climate is going to change so much that we'll have deserts in southern Europe by 2070. The Meteorological Office said temperatures in British summers are going to be 6 degrees hotter by 2070. That rainfall in the winter will be 30% higher. The crop this year looks as if it's over 20% below last year, largely because of the floods that we've seen fields all around Yorkshire, large pools of water, and of course the crop rots if it's waterlogged for more. The seed is waterlogged for more than about 10 days. And the rises in sea level. The whole scale of the environmental crisis is absolutely terrifying. And the scale of inequality too. And we have a government that seems to be saying it can't do anything about that. We have to have leadership that is capable of inspiring a mass movement. I don't think governments in democratic countries can do anything very radical unless there's a really broad political movement to support them. I think Corbyn showed maybe it would be possible to build such a movement. I don't think that means he would have won the next election or maybe the next two. But governments, they're not, the sort of governments we're going to have are not going to do anything about these problems. We've got to go for a government that really can. And I find it's heartbreaking to see a Labour government with an unparalleled majority, an enormous need for money, huge inequalities which we just have to reduce. We have to reduce them not only because of the inequity and the problems Danny was talking about, we have to reduce them also because Thomas Pickett and the Oxfam are both saying that reducing inequality is a precondition for moving towards sustainability, partly because the footprint of the very rich is so high. They are responsible for such a high proportion of the emissions, partly because if you don't tackle that problem of inequality, but try and implement green policies, you get responses like we saw in France with the Gilets jaunes, who actually got Macron to cancel his planned fuel price rises. You'll get that opposition unless you do something like happened in the Second World War, when historians of the war period. If you take Titmuss, for instance, his History of the War and Social Policy, he says that the government recognized that in order to get participation in the war effort, people had to feel that the burden was equally shared. We're not going to solve these environmental policies unless governments understand that. And then the third reason why we have to tackle inequality in relation to the climate crisis is there are now quite a number of papers that show the bigger the inequalities, the higher the status consumption in a society. We all get more neurotic about how others see and judge us. So we're all trying to make ourselves look better, sell ourselves in a way. Lots of other problems coming from that. And unless we tackle these problems, have governments that are trying to build the movement, and Corbyn is never, Starmer is never going to inspire anyone. He kills inspiration. He killed the inspiration that Corbyn was offering. So the government is fine if we were talking about normal times, but we're not.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. So I've got two more questions for the whole panel. But, if you feel like an overwhelming desire to come in and ask a question or make a point, then just, do it. It's fine. It's a Friday night. We can be interactive. But I'm going to be bringing you in soon. But look, the second question, I guess, is this. You've produced a book, this book, Act Now, which I said is a kind of extended Corbyn mandate. I didn't mean that as, disparagingly, it just is. But you want to use the term common sense. You want to, not radicalism, not left-wing, not socialist, but common sense. Danny, you've produced this incredibly powerful book, which is a fictionalized story of the lives of seven children. I've only read 6, but 7 children. In a way, they're both attempts to win progressive arguments, recognizing that it's very hard to win progressive arguments. I think that if Keir Starmer or other people were here, they would say, you need to understand how hard it is to win an election as a party of the centre-left in the UK. So, starting with you, Richard, and keep the comments a bit shorter so we've got time to bring the audience in. Why is it so difficult? Don't blame, and you're not allowed to blame politicians. Why is it so difficult to win progressive arguments in this country?
I don't think it's harder here than anywhere else. I think that I'd put a lot of blame on the press and the mass media. I think we're saved by the BBC, that it's not all our mass media is awful. I know the endless criticisms you could make about the BBC. But I think that the difficulty of winning a movement is that people don't realize how important these issues that I was talking about are. I think that governments are not doing more about, for instance, climate change, makes people feel it must be all right, otherwise they'd be doing something. And I think you have to do things actually that make people feel there is a crisis. And I think there is a lot to be learnt from the war period. I think you have to actually use the little power that the government has got to reduce inequalities and do something so people know that it's making a difference. I think that's got to happen. So I see the problem as you can't change things because you're only words. I think they have to start making it real. And that means using the bit of power as best they can to tackle these issues, and also mass campaigning on these issues, educating the public.
So Kate, let me ask you a slightly different version of the same question, which is that when I was a lad, the working classes voted Labour, the middle classes voted Conservative. That's, of course, now completely flipped round. Labour is the party of the metropolitan liberal elite. The Conservatives, less so in the last election, but in previous elections, have become, the working classes, particularly of the north, have become conservatives, and even, as we saw in the election, open to the appeal of reform. So why is it that progressives in particular have lost the working class?
Because I think they thought that they were on the side of history and a sort of arc of progression and progressive thought that couldn't be reversed. So I think the left sort of felt they'd won those arguments. Women's rights, civil rights in America, rights for various groups, and that we'd just keep on getting a bit more egalitarian and a bit more progressive, and we'd educate more people, and that things were going sort of well. And I think perhaps they couldn't imagine things going so badly wrong. And so maybe they just let it slide and just thought that we would have an aspirational working class that was being educated well. They would see the value of progressive thinking. I think they got locked into sort of their academic and Westminster and other middle class bubbles. And I think the left recognised that. I think Labour recognised that they left behind the kind of engagement they needed to do, perhaps with communities outside of that Westminster bubble, and perhaps in the North in particular. So I think they slipped up and allowed that ground to be captured. But I would agree with Richard, really. I'd put the most blame for this on our media. And I don't know how to solve that one. And you said we're not allowed to say it's just politics, but I do think it's also political cycles. Everybody's frightened to kind of perhaps put in the intellectual hard work to create a medium long-term vision, that needs more political investment, that needs politicians to sort of champion a larger mission, because they're already worried about the next election and they're already worried about doing something quickly.
And politics has been moving to the centre or the right, away from the far left, and so I think less well-off people, the mass of the population, feel that the left hasn't done anything for them.
Well, let's, and I'm not going to give you an easy time, any of you. Isn't this, though, because the left's obsessions are a long way away from actually not just what working class people worry about, but the kinds of things that are written in your book? And let me give you an example of this. I bet if you got a group of left-wing students, middle-class students, and you said to them, what's the average income of families in England, they would get it disastrously wrong.
Yep.
Wouldn't they? They'd say, I don't know, 50,000 or something. They'd get it hugely wrong. If you said to them, tell me about your identity, your gender, ethnic, whatever identity, they would be able to describe it in immense precision. So it's part of the reason that in the end, young people on the left don't want to read big books about class and inequality and all that boring stuff. They'd much rather be in the kind of sexier politics of identity.
It depends which young people on the left. So the majority of young people on the left are not that rich, because there aren't that many rich young people. They are people who might be the first to go to university in their family or have never gone. But you can pick that group. I mean, the group you describe is Oxford University Student Labour Club. The largest club in my university, 700 members. Bless them. I'm a Labour Party member. But yes, they would say 40, 46,000. It doesn't help that my university starts to give you hardship payments if your family income is below 40.
No.
Oh, yeah. Because, of course, people don't know. I'll give you an example of not knowing.
Tell them what the average income actually is.
Well, it's lower for a household than for the individual, which may sound very strange. It's about £25,000 for working. But I'll give you one example. If you remember that man on Newsnight who couldn't believe that he was in the top 5% because he earned about 85,000? That's the top 5% of taxpayers. He was actually in the top 2.5%. 47% of adults in this country do not pay income tax because their income is too low. Right, so even the pundits who were criticising him for not knowing didn't know. That's how ignorant. Have you got that 7 Children book?
I do.
Because you said 6. Can you
Sorry.
spot the error on the cover? Have a look. There's a test of our host. What's the error on the cover?
Oh, God. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 8 of
There's
these
8 bars. Yeah, there's 8 bars on the
That's a
cover.
relief. Do I being put on the spot?
And this is, sorry. The publisher said, you have to turn it around to show them because they've got no idea. When I complained about the fact they put 8 bars on the cover, that it looked much better and balanced nicer. And they won. But there is this real problem of not understanding where we are and how we fit in and how well off we are. Child number 7, typical of the richest 2 million people 2 million children in the UK. There are 14 million children, the 7th are in the best 2 million. She's in the middle. Her mum and dad run a corner shop. They have a disposable income of £50,000 a year to buy
Danny, last time I was on stage with you, you talked about the child who was in the top of the 7 children.
Yeah.
And I think the audience, because they were all a bit posh, thought you were talking about the child in the bottom.
No, exactly. Yeah. And this is where, well, if I go be mean about it, and they're lovely people and I'm one of them, I go to local Labour Party meetings in Oxford, in Marston Ward, average ward in Oxford. On average, our membership are posher than the average people I meet at the university at High Table, right? And that is kind of because of our very divided society and the Hampstead-type constituency. But it's not criticising anybody. When you are the most unequal country in Europe, at the most unequal you've been since the 1930s, you do not understand each other. We live parallel lives. Those constituencies, the red wall ones, you know, kind of things like Rother Valley and so on, all contain areas in the most affluent fifth of the country. They've got names like Great Grimsby. Right, so you hear Great Grimsby, oh, that must be poor. But they all contain areas of affluence. How? Because you go down south, you work in London for 30, 40 years, and then you retire back up north, bring your money, buy a bungalow, and you vote Tory. And people go, oh, look, that's a working class Tory vote. Okay? Or your social class is C2 because you've made £200,000 a year in your small electronics company, but you're working class because you're an electrician. So we get it mucked up. If you look at income and wealth, Labour still and always have been the party of the poorest. But the biggest party of the poorest in Britain now is not voting. It's apathy. If you look at the Brexit vote, the majority of people who voted Leave for social class A, B, C, 1, not the poor. If you look at it geographically, the majority of people who voted Leave lived in the south of England, where a minority of the electorate lived. The Brexit vote was a southern vote of the middle classes. But because there are a few areas of the north where a lot of people didn't vote at all, but of those who did vote, most people voted Leave, we blame it on Stoke and Sunderland. Not on Hampshire or Kent or almost every county in the south that did it. So we just get really, really basic things wrong. And then we keep replicating these stories that are wrong about how our society is because we don't mix and don't know anymore. This one annoyed me. Almost everybody working in W1A that night of the referendum, about our age, had a parent still alive in the southeast and the home counties who had voted Leave, and they were a bit embarrassed about their parents. They, of course, were all Remainers. The minute the exit poll came in and they zoomed in on that blonde lady and 2 balding men in Sunderland, they made up a story in W1A. They had to. Dibble made it up because they had to go off the script. And the story is, we're going to blame the poor, we're going to blame the North. Who do you think funded Brexit? What social class is Nigel Farage? Where did all the money come from? Where is the votes? You know, if we don't understand ourselves, you know, and this isn't me being clever, just look at the numbers.
So can I just ask you then one more question? And I'm going to ask you all to be a bit, you know, a bit briefer. So we can, before I get to the final question for all of you. But Is there one thing, though, when you talk about all this, the reality, that you don't recognise an enormous amount in your books, any of your books, which is that I'm able to say demography is fate. You know, that actually the real deep reality of this country is we're just getting older, and getting older, fewer people working, more people relying on those who are working. If you take Japan has hardly grown for 30 years because it's gone through the demographic process a little bit earlier than us. So when we talk about Britain, the problems of Britain, the crisis of Britain, the difficulties we've got, don't we have to recognise the role of population ageing in that? And I say that as someone over 60 myself.
No, we don't. Because the rest of Europe has aged far more. They've had far lower fertility.
Okay.
Our 14 million children in 2018 is now 14.5 million because of immigration, which of course went up after Brexit. So we are aging, but we're aging less.
Right.
And also because we have the highest mortality rate and life expectancy hasn't increased. And we killed off through austerity far more people in the 10 years before 2019 than COVID killed. And COVID killed 15% of men in their 90s and 10% of women in their 90s. So we're not actually at the very top. Okay. We were aging. We had such a terrible government. Hunt was such an awful health secretary that he managed to stop the population getting older by not helping them live. Right?
But I would just say, while we're on the topic of Japan, what is interesting, I think, about Japan is that it has aged, it has hardly grown, but well-being statistics indicate that people are happier than they were 2 decades ago. It's also an incredibly equal country.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very different country in all sorts of ways, but it's a very egalitarian country in comparison to our own. So, final question, panel. That 97 government, which in the end made more progress on child poverty than almost any government actually in modern times. I heard the other day that a senior civil servant who worked with government post-97 has been asked to come back and do a bit of research on some of the things that Labour did, which were originally evaluated in a rather mixed way or even negatively, but subsequent evaluations have suggested that they were actually much more successful. So Sure Start, for example, the programme for children, first evaluation very mixed, now much more positive evaluation. New Deal for communities, seen not to succeed. Now looking back at those communities, actually, was quite good in some ways. The Troubled Families Initiative, controversial, again, mixed assessment, but now subsequently much more positive assessment. So with that in mind, panel, what do you think this Labour government could usefully learn from what the 97-2010 government did well? Let's finish with something positive before we bring the panel in. Richard, you start.
I think that that question and the previous one, we have to think of a much longer time span. I have been very struck by an extraordinarily close correlation over time between what happens to inequality from 1920s or 1930s onwards and trade union membership. They are almost mirror images of each other. Little inflections in one seem to be inflections in the other. And that's in a number of different countries. I've seen those graphs. I don't think that's just because trade unions do wonders for your wages. I think it's a reflection of a decline since 1980 of the not only the influence of the labour movement, but a belief in some other kind of society, that there is a better way of doing things for all of us. I think that the collapse of communism showed us all that that wasn't the way. I think earlier, in the 30s and 40s, there was considerable fear of communism, and I think it was quite good for capitalism. It led to development of welfare services, welfare states.
Richard, I'm not sure we're getting very close to something that happened that was good after 90. Is your answer because you don't think there was anything good after 97, or are you building up to something?
I'm not concerned with these small shifts.
Okay.
We are not going to get the changes
Well,
in
hang
any...
on, just hold
no,
on. Well,
Matthew.
no, hold on. Hold on. Whatever you want to say about that government, as I said, and Kate kindly nodded, that actually that government reduced child poverty more than almost any other government has done in recent times. They're not getting any credit for that.
Inflection, it's very small narrowing of differences in infant mortality rates. It's not a big change.
Okay.
It's comparatively small.
Right.
The problem is enormous. We're talking about 15-year differences in life expectancy between rich and poor areas.
No, I get that. I hear your answer. Kate, is there anything more that you're willing to defend from that era? Or could be repurposed?
Yes. Yes. But, I mean, I agree with Richard, the positive outcomes were quite small. So the last Labour government had a health inequality strategy. It had targets, and it did various things, some of which you mentioned, like Sure Start and various things around benefits and child tax credits and everything, that worked. But it didn't put enough energy into doing that as deeply as possible. It didn't put enough energy into, I think, trying to protect those things legislatively so it would be harder to unpick them if another government came in. It probably didn't invest enough in the assessment of those as a long-term project. So for most of the things that New Labour did, it took about 10 years for the really positive benefit to show up. If you think it's going to take that long for the things that you're doing to show up, start funding. This is not just a special pleading for myself, but start funding some academics with a long-term grant to make sure that data are collected to see how they do, that they're monitored, and that we do know how they're going to sort of turn out. So they did do some good, but none of it was enough, and none of it was protected.
Were the declines in overall life expectancy during the Blair period?
No. Life expectancy went up until 210.
Yeah, and they did narrow the gap a bit.
I'm sorry, I meant the gap.
Yeah, they narrowed the gap a bit.
In various ways?
Yeah.
Okay. There were some incredibly good things.
I thought it was only...
What I think is interesting is that the things I think were best are not in London by Labour, seen as their great achievements. Ideally, this isn't done by any of us. This observation and evaluation should be done by people from another country who are disinterested. I had my most disconcerting experience. I got my first ever invite to the Sorbonne in Paris, December last year, where I got to go to a conference of French people who are experts in Britain. And they study Britain. And
I've been to that conference.
yeah, there's slightly train spottery in that part of the thing is knowing obscure names of British politicians to show you're really good. But your heart drops when you hear people disinterestedly discuss your country as an experiment. But I think this evaluation should not be being done inside. Achievements. Biggest achievement by far, Good Friday Agreement and peace in Northern Ireland. Measurable. These are measurable in terms of people's lives. Then devolution. So Scotland now has a lower child... This is before anything the SNP did. Scotland has a lower child poverty rate than all of England, including the South East. That's devolution. That was Labour. I think it would have happened with Scottish Labour or the SNP. That's like the arguments, and that's enormous. Fixing the double glazing in the majority of social housing in Britain, which Labour did, but were so embarrassed about doing it because they thought they would lose votes, they didn't tell people we are making sure that people don't go cold in council flats.
Decent homes, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Decent Home Programme. Unbelievable. The beginning of the very first academies, not the rest, not the 57 varieties, the corruption, the privatisation, but those first new school buildings in the worst school in town, right? Mugged it up later, but that was incredible. So a whole set of achievements that Labour doesn't recognise from 1997 to 2010. And then what galls me, when you've just done it, is thinking that moving 1 million of children from one side of a line to another in a way in which their parents largely do not notice, and which, for those born in 2005, they're the first ones who begin to get shorter, doesn't actually materially change their lives. It was a Chinese style, not design. Gordon Brown absolutely wanted to do this. You remember the pledge was to eradicate it. We're going to start with the first million of 4 million. But what we actually did is what is the Chinese style policy. If you just flip people from $1.97 a day to $1.98, and they're still not officially poor then. And it was marginally, it hit the target, but it didn't make people better off. Inequality, the Gini coefficient of inequality absolutely flatlines from 1997 onwards, goes up slightly. In 2009, we overtook Portugal to become the most unequal country in Western Europe, while supposedly eradicating child poverty. And who becomes most poor? Children with families, while supposedly eradicating child poverty. And then by about 2014, we're palming with Bulgaria. So Labour are proud of something they didn't achieve and not proud of what they did achieve. And that's the most important. I'm the wrong person because I'm in the Labour Party. Right? This should be being done. You should have somebody sitting here from Japan, somebody from France, somebody from the USA, who spent all their time studying this country, and there are such academics, and them telling you what they think is good and what's bad. They'll tell you being cosmopolitan and not being racist. We actually score pretty highly against the rest of Europe. But we don't tend to know what we're good at, and we don't tend to know what we're bad at.
And I think why we're all here...
Finally, before we bring the audience in.
I think why we're all here is that, 15 years ago, we did start putting together for the public and for politicians and for policymakers the evidence that inequality was a bad thing, that it affected health, that it affected children's life chances, that it affected social cohesion. And that was all coming to light as we had a change of government. Mm-hmm. And so then we had a government that wasn't actually particularly interested in focusing on those. And yet I went to a meeting in London, I think last year, where people were sitting around saying, well, we've known inequality is bad for a long time and we haven't managed to do anything about it, so perhaps we should stop talking about it. But actually, we've not had a government that you might think would be committed to reducing inequality since we've known the full extent of the damage that inequality does, and now we've got one that might.
Okay, so we have finished on a semi-positive note. Who would like to ask a question, make a point? There's a gentleman right at the back of the room. We're going to keep this poor chap in his yellow jacket on his toes.
Hello. As I'm sure you're all aware, Keir Starmer and David Lammy have had some negotiations with some Mauritian diplomats concerning the sovereignty switch of the Chagos Islands. Considering the Mauritian government never owned such islands, do you think that opens up the debate of the returning of the Koh-i-Noor diamond back to the Indian government?
Wow. Well, we veered somewhere completely surprising, but yeah, I mean, why not? But I'm going to take a few more, and then panel, when I've taken a few questions, just pick one or two. You don't have to respond to all of them.
I like that one.
You'll have that one. Very good. Okay. Who's next? Yeah, there's a gentleman here. Thank you very much. If you could say your name, that would make it easier for the panel as well. And here comes the mic.
Sure. John Hopcroft. I was really quite surprised we've not yet heard a single mention of possibly the biggest policy initiative that's coming out of the current Labour government, namely the employment changes that are fairly well advanced and many of which are aimed at trying to reduce some of the horrid inequalities in the labour market for people who are on zero-hour contracts and the like to improve workers' rights. And in some ways, that's a very traditional labour area. Yeah. The other policy area which there'd be much more mixed feelings about, we haven't really heard anything much said about the winter fuel allowance, which is the other big controversy that this government has introduced. So
Really?
I'll leave it there.
It'd be great to hear your views on the winter fuel allowance, and great to hear your views on, because of course the 97 government did minimum wage, social chapter, all sorts of stuff. This one's going to do more in that space as well. Yes, there's a lady there who really put her arm up, so she's going to be making a passionate point, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Debbie. What advice would you give sick Keir Starmer about his focus and his Chancellor about their focus on growth instead of redistribution, and about greenwash instead of a just transition?
Thank you. And then the gentleman with the glasses on his head, thank you for doing that. Makes it easier to distinguish you.
Roland Atkinson. For me, the elephant in the room is wealth and not income, and how we start to tap the untold millions and billions that are resting either through owner occupation or the super rich more generally.
Great. I think Rachel Reeves will have something to say about that in a couple of weeks. And there's a woman there.
Sorry. I'm Antonia. I'm a second-year student. I also sit on Labour's National Policy Forum, and I'm Secretary of the Labour Society here. And Matthew, I'd just like to assure you that we speak about things far beyond the remit of just gender politics. We have fascinating discussions, particularly about relative versus absolute poverty. But you recommend, particularly Kate and Richard, about the abolition of private schools. But how do we make that sort of just transition if, I presume that Labour will keep backtracking on the VAT on private schools, but how do we make that just transition, other than it just being a utopian idea? How do we move towards that?
Thank you. I helped to design the National Policy Forum, so, I'm not all bad. Yes, and there's a woman there who's going to be approached from this side, I think. Very good. I'll take two more after this, and then the panel just choose a few of those, because we have to finish at 7:40 so we can flog your books. Right.
Hi, I'm Katia. I actually work with Matthew at the NHS Confederation. When you're talking about...
Sorry.
When you're talking about inequalities, one of the most stark inequalities in this country is actually to do with race and to do with gender, amongst other things. And in healthcare, you're talking black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth, and Bridget Gorman's just released a report that shows that if you invest in gynecological and women's health services, for every £1 you invest, you'll get an £11 return into the economy. So when we're talking about inequalities, do any of the panel have any ideas what we could do, especially around improving race equality in this country?
Great, thank you. Yes, those health inequalities are incredibly stark. And I'm going to go to the gentleman up there, I think has got a beard.
Hi, my name is Jeff Fletcher. The question is, with the advancement of artificial intelligence, do the panel think it will have a positive or negative effect on equality?
Excellent technology. And then finally, last but not least, we're going to go to this chap over here who's got a tie on, which is always nice to see on a Friday evening.
Hi there. So my question is about the...
Your name?
Alexandro.
Thank you.
About the policy discount rate. So considering that, the Labour government might not be particularly liked for cutting the fuel payments for this winter, do you think they will have enough time to actually put into play their policy, their economic policy, for the long term? Or do you think they'll just be changed and then we'll just end up, with another new government trying to go the other direction and they just have a push and pull without actually getting anywhere?
No, it's a really good point. There was a mayor in Scandinavia who introduced congestion charging and said he'd have a referendum 10 years after it was introduced. And then it was overwhelmingly endorsed, which I thought was quite a clever way of addressing this issue of this kind of political discount rate, as you elegantly described it. Yeah, great question. So panel, I'm going to kind of footle on for about 30 seconds while you're thinking, but a lot of really fascinating questions there, and you've each only can have about 2 or 3 minutes, but I want you to pick out don't, for goodness sake, try and answer all of them, but pick out 2 or 3 of those questions that you thought that you most keen on answering. I'd love to answer all of them, apart from one at the back, which I know nothing about. But I'm not going to, because I'm the chair.
Was that the Cohen or Diamond?
That was the Cohen or Diamond. Danny's got that one already.
No.
All right, we're all going to answer your question at the back. See, what a great question it was.
Well,
right, Kate.
I think we should give it all back.
Okay.
Cohen or Diamond, Elgin marbles, you name it.
We could abolish the monarchy and then give back the diamonds. It's in the crown, isn't it?
Very
I'm not
good.
sure.
But you've been the first subjects that you've caused unanimity across the room, so thank you so much.
Anything that we sort of robbed, took, why don't we give it back?
There'll be nothing left in my city.
That's okay. That's okay. Because actually we have, and maybe this is a positive use of AI, it doesn't mean we couldn't visit them virtually wherever we give them back. We can see the Elgin marbles virtually whenever we want. We have the technology.
Good.
So we can give all of that back. I'll take a question about the employment changes. Those are really positive. And I think those will make a huge difference to an awful lot of people. And actually, the changes to work that we've seen over recent decades have been phenomenally big. And people's experience of work, I think, has changed so much from when Richard was growing up, I was growing up, we were entering the labour force. And so I think to try and address that precarity of employment and the lack of rights and the 0 hours contracts and all of those sorts of things, I think that's really positive. There's been quite a muted reception, though. I haven't seen a lot of celebration of that. So I think you were right to sort of raise it and for us to mention that today. And I think maybe we have all been a bit grumpy tonight because...
You're talking about me.
Who thinks the panel have been a bit grumpy? Put your hand up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's do it again. I'm really fascinated. Who thinks the panel's been too grumpy? Put your hand up. Right? Who thinks the panel have been not grumpy enough? And who thinks they've been just right in the grumpiness? Well, the room is totally split. On the grumpiness issue, there is no consensus.
I'll be really quick.
Okay.
I think we're grumpy because we've got a new Labour government and we're delighted to have a change of government, but we'd really like bigger vision, bigger promises, more excitement, a real sense that we're being painted a picture of a better society and a better future. And I think that's why we're a bit grumpy, while we're not denying that we are seeing some good things happening, and it is a lot better than this time last year.
Thank you. There's a nice arc to this event appearing, Richard. Please don't spoil it.
I would like to answer the question about growth and redistribution as the aims of Labour. I think it's really important that people understand the relationship between the real quality of our lives and standards of health and economic growth. I'll draw this graph the right way round for you, but if you have GNP per capita along the bottom and poorer countries there and richer countries there, happiness, health, measures of well-being all rise very fast in the early stages of economic growth, and then it flattens out. And you get some countries that are twice as rich as others, and yet they don't have better life expectancy, they don't have higher levels of happiness and life satisfaction and so on. The two have become completely separate. Life expectancy does go on improving in most countries, even the rich countries, but no longer related to economic growth. Whether you take shorter periods or longer periods of economic growth, no relationship. I think we must, and we have to get, we have to stop emphasizing growth, but emphasize innovation. I think there are real qualities, improvements in the quality of our lives that can come from innovation. And some of them actually are capital and labour saving and perhaps don't show up. I think the measures of growth actually are pretty poor, particularly in terms of the real value of changes as they impact on human well-being.
Thanks, Richard. And of course, they don't capture one of the biggest changes to all our lives, which is that we have a device in our pocket which opens up the world's knowledge, but also opens up all sorts of psychologically challenging things for us as well. And that's been a huge shift in our lives, which is often missed out in the statistics. Danny, you're going to have the last word.
I was going to try and do a couple of these. David Lammy could absolutely save his reputation by beginning to better tackle some of these issues. And in a country with very little money, looking at some of the embarrassing things to do with our colonial position in the past. One problem is that our Privy Council are the ultimate authority for a whole series of treasure islands around the world, which are helping world inequality to stay high. So Labour could certainly do something on that. Wealth taxes. Already non-dom status is being changed. This country cannot borrow more from abroad or from its own people because we don't have it, but from abroad because they won't lend it to us. That began when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did their wonderful 49 days in power. We lost our credibility. So we can't borrow it without paying a fortune. So the only way we can have the money to stop children going hungry is to take it from the very wealthy, who don't flee. We know this, they won't go. And those that will go are the kind of people you don't want staying in your country. So they're going to have to come in. The only question is how and at what rate and how small. I don't think they're going, unless you tell me I've missed the news, I don't think they're going to backtrack on the VAT on schools. I think that's just the beginning of it. You may not know this, but the rest of Europe has hardly any private schools. They're not a normal thing to do. There is educational divisions, there are grammar schools and other things that go on, but paying for your children not to mix with other children, it's a bizarre thing to do and doesn't happen in other countries.
A lot of it in York.
And paying 30% of the money you spend on secondary education on just 7% of children, those who need it the least. Can you imagine the effect of a child of going to a boarding school which costs £60,000 a year at the age of 13 and being told at that boarding school, it's Eton by the way, that the reason why it costs £60,000 a year is because you're so special, young man, that your special brain needs more culturing by our brilliant teachers because one day you will lead this country, or Winchester, or rugby, or whatever. I go to these schools, I talk to them, one advantage of my job is they don't read what I write, they look at my job title and invite me. But it is highly damaging on young people to be educated separately and educated privately. I wouldn't ban it. I think it's a good idea to ban things. The country I've studied most is Finland. About 0.5% of children go private in Finland. Best schools in the world, you just go to the nearest school in Finland. But don't ban it. Keep it for certain freedoms, but also to know that your state sector is working. It's a litmus test. It's a canary in the mine to do it. So I think that's beginning. I won't try AI and wrap up. Employment, if you click on the BBC story today about the employment changes Labour are going to make, what you get is, we don't know yet. So it's promised, but there's a worry that it's being watered down in what we'll get. If you think about the turmoil of the last few years, if you just go through from David Cameron saying there's going to be a referendum, the unexpected Conservative majority in 2015, when we thought we were going to get another coalition, if you go through just how long that Brexit process took, if you add a pandemic, if you add the fact that Johnson actually became Prime Minister, right, which you now think of as normal, but that was as ridiculous as Donald Trump becoming president, which was a joke before he first did it. If you think about the cost of living crisis, becoming a banner on the top of the BBC, along with the war on Gaza and climate change. All these things that weren't predicted that have occurred so rapidly, changing 3-4 prime ministers without elections. Turmoil, utter and complete turmoil. The idea it's going to be boring for the next 2 or 3 years, it's not. We have a prison service that is failing. We have a whole series of government departments with flashing red lights. The housing sector, Gove had instigated a whole dashboard. It cost a lot of money to get all the statistics about what's going on with housing. It was all flashing red in his last 6 months as minister. We have rising numbers of people, again, on the streets. We have black mold getting worse. It's not good, but in this state of things, it is possible to turn around. And it was last we were this unequal that the turnaround occurred. The majority of the deals that trade unions are making are now progressive. They weren't in 2019. The lowest paid workers are getting the biggest rises, the highest aren't. Top civil servants are now 25% poorer than they were in 2008. Lower grade civil servants, 12% poorer. All poorer, but all the gaps are narrowing. And we're beginning to see that. The last thing I'll say is there's the wonderful news I saw from my train on the way up. For those of you who experienced the train from Birmingham to York, the wonderful thing that occurred today is the service was so terrible and so packed that an announcement came over the tannoy that the first-class carriage is now being discontinued. And you may claim a refund between your first-class and second-class price, and anybody who wants to can go into the first-class carriage just to be able to get some space on the train. How did we get rid of the first and second-class system on the train from Birmingham to York? By having such a disaster, it wasn't possible to keep the class system going any longer. On that anecdote, I am optimistic.
Very good. Well, I've just thought of a joke to sum up the entire evening, which is, what do Labour governments and cross-country trains have in common? They're never as long as you want them to be. So there we are. It's been a fascinating conversation. The room is mixed on the levels of grumpiness, which should be appropriate for 100 days into a Labour government. But thank you for some fantastic questions. Please go outside and get copies of 7 Children, of Act Now, of the Spirit Level 15-year update. But most of all, can I ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful panel, Richard, Kate and Danny. Thank you.